and I click got it because I agree to that. Okay, I am sharing my screen. Hopefully that is visible in the way that it should be. And hopefully I'm audible in the way that I should be as well. So thank you, Christian, for the lovely introduction. And as well, congratulations to Christian just in this forum for that fantastic bit of news you've had for funding. It's important for people to be doing interesting work and getting really interesting work funded. So I just wanted to say that in an open forum. So yes, I'm Andrew Gibson. I'm based in Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. Thank you all for coming today, whatever time it may be there. Hopefully blood sugar levels are okay, or we have the concentration to get us on. It's daunting, obviously, to be following on from Ron Barnett, who kicked us off on this. But happily, Ron's talk recently got me thinking about this and got me reconsidering these things. And it's just really important that we have this kind of series of talks that we're able to explore these ideas. And I'm looking forward, obviously, to Jakob and Christian's talk, Lily Yang's talk, Carolina's, and Søren's talks as well that are yet to come. So this is what I will be talking about today. Ontology from the middle, knowing, asterisk, higher education from somewhere. And a little bit about, I suppose, my presuppositions or where I'm coming from. I'm not setting out really with a definition of ontology. I'm assuming in some ways that we come to this term as being understood, but understood by whom and from where and how. I suppose my philosophical upbringing would mean that I understand phenomenology from the phenomenological tradition. So that's what I'm engaging with, and that's what's in the background of my head when I'm talking about this. I'm also engaging with this, though, in terms of an initial critique. And so for this, I go to Emmanuel Levinas, I'm going to Tautology and Infinity, and there he talks about ontology as a reduction of the other to the same by the interposition of a middle and neutral term. So when he's talking about something that we would call ontology, he starts initially with existence. So those things that exist that are us, that is then transformed into something else. It's transformed into this notion of being. So that is that middle and supposedly neutral term. But in discussing that, he suggests that there's an ontological imperialism here, as by turning existence into being in some way, it's trying to reduce otherness. It's trying to make these existence subordinate to being in some way. And I think that notion of reduction is worth, and its various implications, is worth holding in our mind as we proceed. And it may be that Heidegger is one representative of the ontology that he is talking about. So I looked to Heidegger, and I looked to Heidegger when I was thinking about this question, and specifically his text, Introduction to Metaphysics. And in that, he refers to how others, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, have engaged with and addressed ontology as a question. So ontology as a question asked of being, and the effort to put being into words. But almost immediately, his suggestion is that there's an answer to this, and that logos is the way that we can answer the notion of being, and logos being this notion that we have rationality that we apply immediately, as well as all the other various terms that he attaches to this. And by thinking about ontology in terms of logos, he's contrasting it with what he calls sarma, which is a nice way of saying the dunghill, a pile of shite, we would say in Ireland. And this is referencing Heraclitus, and he's talking about this quote. This is one of the ones he explores, where he talks about that's the alternative. The alternative to thinking about being in terms of logos and that rationality is just the dung heap. And that's kind of, for me, that's reminiscent of where Deleuze and Guattari are starting, I suppose, with their notion of chaos. But they dwell with the chaos and they try to explore that chaos in a way where Heidegger is attempting to do something different. Approached in this way, what Levinas suggests is that this is a really serious kind of reduction, because by setting up being as being something that is only for the strong, that's about rank and dominance, that's about hierarchy, Levinas is suggesting that something has been foreclosed already, so that perhaps we give the existent a silhouette, but it's lost its face, it's lost some of that particularity. And for that reason, he starts thinking about, how that formulation of ontology gives him pause and sent him in a different direction. And that notion of ontology as being, as logos, also sent me in another direction. It gave me cause to pause also, because those efforts at reduction to logos, reduction to rationality, made me feel suspicious. So for that reason, I started considering, what might be the other resources to interrogate being, to interrogate the claims of ontology. And I came to this question not really from ontology initially. I wasn't thinking about this as an ontological question initially. I didn't set out to do ontology. Rather, it became necessary to kind of return to ontology. So that meant engaging with some of the difficulties I'm talking about. And I suppose the first thing to say is when we're talking about ontology and we're in the context of the university, epistemology is the thing that presents itself to us as the perfectly sensible philosophical mode with which to proceed. Universities are knowledge institutions. Those of us who work there, knowledge is a large part of our concern. And it's not just also, I suppose, to say it's not just knowledge as research and teaching, but it's also everyone else is working in the university and in institutions of higher education. There's all those other kinds of knowledge that are necessary to run these large organizations, the financial knowledge, the organizational knowledge, the administrative knowledge, that's part of any large organization. But specifically because there is that aspect of research and teaching, there's a reflexivity attached to knowledge in the university. Specifically, I would say for those of us who are engaged with research and teaching. So that makes the university more than just another, quote, knowledge society organization. We are in this institution and we're reflecting on our knowledge. We're reflecting on the conditions of its creation, perhaps. We're asking where this knowledge comes from, who produced it, under what conditions, with what assumptions, and so on. And then we have these kinds of concepts that help us to do this kind of reconsideration and this reflexivity. So we have Fricker's epistemic injustice, or epistemic justice as well. We have Sousa Santos talking about epistemologies of the North and epistemologies of the South. These are ways we start interrogating that, where this knowledge is being done. So there's that question of what's our stance when we're engaging with knowledge. And for this, I was reading Julieta Singh's lovely book on thinking mastery. And she suggests, she's looking at her own work, that an important thing to do is to think about what do we mean when we're engaging with knowledge? Because one of the things that is assumed is we would have mastery of our knowledge, we would have mastery of our field. And her suggestion is that even using that phrase mastery, or that metaphor, whatever it may be, it's linked with overall projects of mastery. It's linked with the colonial project of mastery. And her suggestion is that that notion of mastery that suffuses how we consider our engagement with the world is something that needs to be engaged specifically from the post-colonial or anti-colonial perspective. But she suggests also for the rest of us who may be working in other intellectual pursuits also needs to do that. And I suppose when I was starting to read that, and I was thinking, well, perhaps someone might push back by saying, well, isn't it just a metaphor? Or, we could pick other words, or it's an unfortunate choice of words. But I think I agree with Julieta Singh when she's saying there's more to it than that this notion of mastery aligns with Heidegger's view of ontology as dominance in a way. It's a way of structuring how we think. And it doesn't strike me as mere coincidence that the abstracting universalist view that Thomas Nagel talked about as the view from nowhere, that critique is supported from various different directions by scholars for whom universal, or the notion of universal, defined them out of existence or defined them to the margins. And I'm thinking about feminism, I'm thinking about post-colonial, anti-colonial thought, I'm thinking about critical race studies, queer studies, disability studies. There's a critique, and a long-standing critique of this notion of a universal engagement there, which is important. But also I was saying, I came back to ontology out of necessity in a way, because of the experience of COVID-19, of being of the university, but not being in the university. I was thrown out back on my own resources, and what was I going to do with that? But community started online and engagement started. And while the standard lines of access within the institution were interrupted, we were thrown back on our own resources. But they were resources. That's the point. There were resources with which we were able to do something. And so I started to think about, well, what's the nature of these resources? It's not within the structure of standard engagement, I suppose, because nobody was at the center anymore. Nobody was on top of things. We were a bit adrift, but we were finding ways to connect. And at the same time, I started rereading and probably understanding it for the first time, in aspects of it at least, Deleuze and Guattari. And in that, there's a lovely discussion at the start of the rhizome. And they write on page 24 about the plateaus. And they say the plateaus always in the middle, not always always in the middle, not at the beginning or the end. And they say furthermore that it's not easy to see things in the middle rather than looking down at them from above or up at them from below. And for whatever reason, this just resonated with me and stuck with me. And I thought, well, maybe there might be something to this, and I can explore where else I can go with this. There was other resources I thought maybe would be worth considering. So how to look at things from a not universal perspective, how to look at the university and higher education from a not universal perspective. And I was sensitized to this notion of mastery from Julieta Singh. So I started grazing. There was people like Madhavi Menon, who comes at the notion of a queer engagement with ontology. And I thought, that's interesting, might see what comes of that. And then Anna Lohanab Singh, I started reading her work, and she has this notion of these zones of awkward engagement. And I thought, well, we're in a zone of awkward engagement at the moment. There's something to that as well. But there was a specific introduction to a special issue by Manlansan et al. And what this was looking at was queer studies and the Midwest. Very specific special issue that was edited. But there's a quote I'd like to read that stuck with me. And in the introduction to this special issue by Martin Manlansan and colleagues, he says, quote, "The middle creates a less magisterial panoramic perspective than a queer vantage, a troubled, unstable perch buttressed by the dominance of the coasts and the south. We believe that such instabilities are productive of alternative ways to approach space and time and to reimagine routes and paths, contours and shapes, directions and teloces of queer lives, practices and institutions." End quote. So the middle creates a less magisterial coming from master, coming from mastery. So there were these kinds of resonance I was starting to pick up, and I thought, well, perhaps this is the direction I'm going to go in. I'm going to engage with this body of work, queer studies, queer theory, because that's the literature that I know best. So that's what I chose to explore. So I'm going to offer an account of where I went with this. And the first person I want to talk about is Karen Thompson, who's a queer studies scholar based in Southern California. And she has a lovely book called Relocations. And in this, she's making what she calls two critical interventions against US national discourses about the suburbs. And the first one is this notion that the suburbs are racially, in class terms, and sexually homogenous, that they're just kind of flat and white. They're the product of white flight from the cities, and that's what they are. So she wanted to interrogate that and push back against that and say, well, there's more to the suburbs than that, actually. The second thing she wanted, she does make an intervention against, is what she calls the compulsory narrative of migration to the queer center. So to unpack that for a second, it's the notion that in coming out, for one to come out as queer, this implies almost or necessitates migration to the queer center, wherever that may be. So you come out in Ireland and you move to Dublin, or you move to London, or you move to Beijing, or you move to Berlin, or wherever is the queer metropole. So what she's doing there is it's a critique of that compulsory narrative and saying, well, perhaps there are ways to be queer in the suburbs, and that perhaps the suburbs are queer, but it's not given consideration. And in a way of doing this, she uses Halberstam's lovely notion of metronormativity. So this is the notion that cities are the place where one can be queer, that this is the definition, that the center is the queer place to be. And the center and this notion of the queer city has an outsized role in queer studies and in queer culture, I suppose, in many ways, and in scholarship. So George Chauncey and Charles Kaiser's books about queer New York, the queer Bildungsroman that exists in lots of countries where the young person is growing up in the countryside and then they start to realize things about themselves, and then they move to the city and they find a community, and happy ending or not, often not. And in talking about this, what Thompson is doing is kind of starting to critique the purported radicality of these queer centres, and maybe radical is to queer as excellent is to academic. So there's parallels here. But it's this notion of there's a normativity attached to going to the city, and that's the way things should be done. It's New York or nowhere. Perhaps then the parallel for the university is, it's the best and the rest. And what Tongson is doing, she's arguing from the suburbs. So not just that there's the city and the countryside, but there's something else. But in arguing from the suburbs, it's not an argument just about regionalism, but it's about provincialism, in fact. And it's borrowing from E. Sedgwick. And what the difference is between a region and being regional and being provincial is there's an effect of neutrality attached to regionalism. There's an effect of, or affected neutrality even of regions, that they're just subdivisions. But the point that Tongson is making is that no, actually, can be a conscious embrace of the naivety of being provincial and how that's a resource. There's an irreverence in not taking oneself or things too seriously. That in being provincial, there's an irreverence rather than irony, is what she's suggesting. So that's an important thing that she identifies. Another really interesting piece about this work is she suggests in suburbia that being is different, or to be is different in suburbia. And in suburbia is a reference to the Pet Shop Boys, which is one of the things she talks about, is being in the car and listening to music. So in the suburbs in Southern California, you're traveling from place to place. There's not a great infrastructure. I think maybe that's the case in Ireland as well. So you end up in modes of transport to go from places. It's a large distance apart. So a large part of your time is spent in the car driving from one space to the other. So there your being is aural as well as visual. So you're looking what's going on outside the car, but you're also listening to music. You're listening to the traffic. You're listening to the beeping of horns. But there's also, so that's that aspect of there being other aspects of being beyond what we see. So this is not the view from somewhere, but this is knowing in a wider sense, that the sound of the car radio while driving, the smells of petrol and tarmac on the freeway. This is a being that's somewhere quite specific. It's a being as well in the middle, or in between places, or at the edge. Matt Brim has a wonderful book called Poor Queer Studies, and this is the second resource I'm drawing on here. And in this, what he's basically doing is applying queer studies tools to itself. And he asks a question, which is, what does queer studies look like from the point of view of regional or mid/low tier or unranked schools being institutes of higher education largely? And what he's doing here, his use of the word poor is also avoiding affected neutrality. So, where Tongson talks about provincial rather than regional, he talks about poor rather than, the resources of under-resourced in some ways. And this is an important aspect of a positional ontology, that it is specific in that way. And it avoids an affected and affective neutrality. So what he's doing in this, he's contrasting what he calls rich queer studies with with poor queer studies. And he suggests that rich queer studies sees being rich, being in a wealthy institution, as the default mode. He's writing from another perspective and in resistance to what he calls the aspirational mode attendance to top universities. So here we have queer studies speaking directly to higher education studies. And higher education here is the point, because Brim's not based in a university. He's based in City College of New York in Staten Island. So the default view, the universal, let's say, view of higher education as a university is called into question there. And the vision of the middle, as I'm working with, is captured by not being a top institution. So he talks about mid or low tier or unranked. So that's what he's talking about. It's middle as an evaluation, as well as being, not being central. Staten Island is in New York, yes, but it's hardly Manhattan. Middle also applies to the being of the student that he's talking about. And in the third chapter is called Vocational Queer Studies. He talks about students working their way through higher education. They're frequently not students who just left school and have gone directly into higher education. So they're in fact in the middle of their lives. And this interrupts that rich discourse of higher education as being effectively preparation for work, that they're going directly into work after higher education, and that higher education is only for that. It's especially powerful here in this institutional context because it's a poor institution, as he calls it. And there's parallels here with Bell Hooks's work in terms of teaching to transgress and the importance of theory and the importance of engaging with critical theories in order to interrogate your own existence. In terms of what the being is here that he's talking about, the being then is, you know, of these students, the being is of his position within the within his institutional framework and within the disciplinary framework that he's in. It's also the beings and the kind of experience that they're having. And the first or the introductory chapter is called Poor Queer Dinners. And in that, he's extending again our notion of, well, what's worth talking about when we're talking about beings in higher education. And in Poor Queer Dinners, he's talking about the kinds of food that are available from the vending machines. So in a poor institution like this, there's not a well-stocked canteen, or if the classes are held after night, literally after hours, the only place to get some food is from vending machines. So the being here that he's talking about is a being that can taste, a being that can smell. So we're continuing this expansion of the expanded range of what being is. And there's an overlap here in terms of what he suggests could be a theory of the middle of his kind of institution. And he does refer to Manuel San actually in this, and he talks about the use of the term itself is useful because it's, he says it's stretchy. So the middle is conceptually useful here. The third person I want to talk about is Jack Halberstam, and specifically Halberstam's book, The Queer Art of Failure. And in this, Halberstam is drawing on Stuart Hall's notion of low theory, so low theory in contrast to high theory. And Halberstam is doing this in order to talk about a type of theorizing that explores alternatives, that explores in-between spaces, so as to find, quote, a way out of the usual traps and impasses of binary formulations, end quote. The benefit of this approach to low theory is that there's a possibility that alternatives dwell in what Halberstam calls the murky waters of a counterintuitive, often impossibly dark and negative realm of critique and refusal. So it's not all sweetness and light, and it's not all brightness, and that's an important thing, because what Halberstam is doing is using low theory to explore a notion of queer failure. Quote, as Halberstam says, queer failure is something that queers do and have always done exceptionally well, end quote. So what does failure mean here? Well, it's failing to be respectable. It's failing to measure up to familial expectations. It's failing to be, well, normal. So what can we learn from failure? What can we learn from not being excellent in a way? Halberstam suggests that failure, in fact, has its own rewards, and that it can, quote, preserve some of the wondrous anarchy of childhood and disturb the supposedly clean boundaries between adults and children, end quote. So what Halberstam is talking about there is how failure is a part of when one is experiencing being as a child, as a new being, but that's something we learn to push away and not engage with anymore. It's also failure, a way of resisting toxic positivity. So this is referring back to that notion of critique and refusal. But in rejecting that kind of toxic positivity, Halberstam is suggesting that there's something which is like a new kind of optimism in the togetherness of knowing that the meaning of the other always depends, the meaning of the one always depends on the meaning of the other. So the suggestion is there that in a way, when we fail in the context of other people, ideally. That's the way that failure can be its own reward. And much like Brim, also higher education is referred to, and the place of failure of higher education is drawn on. And Halberstam admits that if we talk about failure in higher education, we're running the risk of not being taken seriously, of not being rigorous in some way, which are, quote, code words in academia as well as other contexts for disciplinary correctness, end quote. So there's this notion that by returning to this thing of failure, of being able to fail, of learning how to fail, that we're pushing back against this reductive notion of what it is to be in the university. And Halberstam also goes on to note that, quote, it may not be a bad time to experiment with disciplinary transformation on behalf of the project of generating new forms of knowledge. And we might return to that in a bit. There's a proposal in here, and this is a nice thing about that low theory can do. Low theory doesn't just sit content with critique. And Halberstam is referring to Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey's subversive intellectuals, the notion of the subversive intellectual and what that intellectual can do. And the first supplement to Moten and Harvey's notion of the subversive intellectual is Halberstam is saying that we resist mastery. That failure indeed is a refusal of mastery. And I appreciate the overlaps here now that are starting to emerge between these different thinkers. The second is privileging the naive or the nonsensical, and overlaps there perhaps with Tongson talking about being provincial. And the third is suspecting memorialization and being less committed to finding heroic models from the past. And the goal of this is to, as Halberstam is saying, to unleash new forms of memory. So it can be useful to draw on our past, but not to stay too closely stuck to it. So to kind of just summarize where we have been and where we might go with these, this is an account. I'm offering what Julia Annis would call an account. It's not a theory, but the suggestion is that with these three thinkers, we've got somewhere. We have actually gotten somewhere. So we're no longer nowhere, and it's no longer the view of nowhere, but we are somewhere. And Tongson suggests that we're outside the usual space. We're in between, at the edge. So that's perhaps middle as place. Brim has given us, we're no longer at the top. So this is middle as poor, or middle as being in a community in some way. So it's middle as place and middle as a kind of evaluation. And then Halberstam has given us failure and what we can learn from this, of what can we learn from not being excellent. So this is the middle as affect, the middle as action, as resource, the middle as being middling. And from all of these as well, we have beings, an ontology that is from and of somewhere. And the beings that are there are beings that see things, but they also smell things, they hear things, they taste things, and they feel things. We have the being of an institution, of its inhabitants, of the lecturers and workers that are there. And we have an ontology of the middle as somewhere. It's an ontology of specificity, of community, of particularity. So the implications of this, well, I think there's a few implications. So Ron was talking about Roy Basker's approach to ontology as diving down into things, and Ron was suggesting that he was going to go up in the air. And for variety, I suppose, I'm going to stay put. So this is an ontology where just kind of staying where I am. So this is ontology in some ways, perhaps from within, not getting off the ground, but it's seeing what happens when we dwell with that. It's seeing what happens when we do stay put. So it's also trying to interrogate what happens when we dwell with being, when we do just stick around and see what we can do with it. And I was thinking about other kind of thinkers that might be resources in this, and Murray Bookchin, the anarchist thinker, popped into my head here because he talks about forgoing the temptations of statecraft for politics. He says politics is the stuff that we do on a human-to-human basis, but statecraft is the stuff we read about in opinion pages in newspapers. And perhaps we should spend more time with politics than statecraft. But it also reminded me of Bruno Latour's work when he was talking about being terrestrial. So moving away from the notion of global, or rejecting the notion of global in some ways, and being with and being beside other terrestrial beings. It also sprung to mind that David Graeber has that nice phrase of there being a sociology of micro-utopias, and perhaps that's what each of these figures have been exploring, are these micro-utopias. So we have, in the case of Bookchin, it's kind of an ontology for anarchists. With Latour, it's an ontology for people in the Anthropocene or the climate workers, and for Graeber, perhaps it's an ontology for activists. So what's coming through there is that this is an argument for a profusion of ontologies and considering these as tools. Now, of course, there can be criticism of this in that it's an ontology that never really gets off the ground. But what a suggestion is that this is, a description in some ways, but it's not necessarily an exhaustive one, and it's not claiming to be, because it's foregoing mastery in that sense. What it is aiming for is a kind of thicker description and perhaps a richer vocabulary or a new vocabulary. But to borrow from Tongson, my goals in this are modestly scaled, and I think that's something we can work with. As well, it's also ontology as resisting hierarchy. It's foregoing mastery again. So we can't resist hierarchy. It's there. We can use it at times, but there is a duty to resist perhaps the notion of a permanent hierarchy or a hierarchy of essences. That there's something there that there's worthwhile reducing. It's worthwhile resisting reduction, and perhaps an embrace of profusion is one way to do that. And there's another Deleuze-Guattari point about that I'll return to. It's also an attempt to reconceptualize power. And this is the notion of the middle as being among others and having influence and having empowerment. It's something I've explored elsewhere. But it's also that thing about the center is not the middle. The middle is not the center. So when we're in the middle, we're among others, but not necessarily attempting to put ourselves at the center and put ourselves on top again. There might also be implications for how we think about space. And I've played with this a little bit in terms of nomadology and how that applies to policy. But perhaps here, what we're seeing is space not in terms of levels, but as dimensions and realms that are interpenetrating, that things are a bit messier, but if we're in the middle of it, we can see how it makes sense. For higher education, there's an issue with going in the direction of universalism, and I do like to avoid critique that kind of revels in its own sliciness without proposing something. And so my aim here is to try propose something or open something up, at least open up some cognitive space. And for that, I think I always like to think about other people who are going in a similar direction. I'm basically talking about people who got here first, people who got here before me. So Hans Schildermans is one who springs to mind in terms of when he's talking about inhabiting the ruins of excellence. I see definitely that there's parallels with his project and the work that he's been doing. Barbara Grant, her work also on the notion of 1,000 tiny universities and the inhabiting academic being and what that can be. And when she talks about evading the fatalistic binary, and occupying this binary through the tiny university we enact daily, I definitely see parallels in what she's attempting to do. I also see parallels with things like The Slow Professor, Bergen Sieber, with Slow Science of Isabel Stengers. So while it might seem, kind of simpler to have one master ontology, I think what a lot of us are getting towards is embracing a profusion of types of ontologies as tools. But what I would want to suggest is we're using tools in different cases in different contexts. So there's the question of what do we want our ontology to do? So if we're somewhere, we presumably want to do something. But is that academic and scholarly activity, or is that organizing and activist activity? And perhaps there's different ontologies which are appropriate in each of those cases. There's the question then about, what ontology then ultimately am I talking about? What kinds of beings am I talking about in higher education? What am I suggesting we can talk about with this view? And I'm thinking about, there's process, there's a being with, there's being in the middle, there's being in the mix, there's being in the ground. There's different kinds of being as have been discussed, as in the being of students, but what kind of students are we talking about? At what stage in their lives are they? There's the being of the institution itself, of the students in it. This is how we evaluate that being. We're in the middle in various ways, in the middle of our lives, in the middle of doing something, in between other space, or perhaps just feeling middling, not feeling great. And I think there's something there that we can explore. In terms of specific applications, I mean, I'm thinking, I've said different things. There's maybe, instead of international student flows, looking at those snarls, the friction, being in the middle, inhabiting those difficulties that our international students experience. I'm thinking also of the notion that, there's a way of thinking about terrestrial higher education, moving away from the global. So what are the interactions that we're dealing with there? And then the notion of organization. So this notion of being in the middle in terms of a community. So it's not just international organizations and, you know, the OECD and the World Bank, but there's networks and associations, there's unions, there's ways that we are in the middle of what we do with other people. But this is just a suggestion. To wrap up, and just this is my final bit, I wanted to return to the original quote from Deleuze and Guattari that provoked me, which is this quote where they talk about it's not easy seeing things in the middle rather than looking down on them from above or up at them from below, or from left to right or right to left. Try it, you'll see that everything changes. And I thought that would be a neat way to wrap things up, but it seemed a bit too neat. It seemed a bit pat. And it got me thinking about, well, no, Andrew, what can we actually do with this? What can we do with this account of an ontology from the middle? And my suggestion is that other ontologies have not served us very well. And that an ontology from the middle seems to me more conducive to higher education and the ideal of the university we're trying to enact. It also appears all the more urgent in the context of the troubles we're experiencing. Wherever we are, in some places, those troubles have been going on for a long time with no respite. And I think it's urgent for everyone on this earth for the upheavals due to us in large part because of global warming. So I present to you this account of an ontology of the middle for when we're on the edge and for when everything changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I would say this was superbly complex and inspiring presentation of the ontology and perspective from the middle. And you already have two discussants, like Ron and Soren already asked their questions in the chat. And I would, instead of warming up the discussion, I would simply allow them to ask and voice their question loudly. Soren, please start, or Ron.
Would you go first, Ron? That would be fine.
I'd rather not. Okay, Soren, go first.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrew. Really inspirational unpacking of the ontology of the middle. And I think you really contributed with a lot of new ways of approaching that that I'll definitely think about. And thanks also for the references, some of these very inspiration-looking books, book titles. Yes, my question, maybe it's just a footnote, a technical consideration about if you still have this Hegelian understanding of dialectics, if it's still a form of maybe imperialism, still of a form of assimilation of the peripheries into the same, into sameness. Maybe the sameness will expand and take on new forms and be more diverse and plural in its manifestations, but still a form of dialectics. Where, because in relation to your starting point in Levinas, it's hard to connect a dialectical understanding, which is ontological, I think, and an understanding of otherness, which in Levinas, perhaps only Levinas and the early Sartre, as I know about, resist dialectics as such, as a premise for their entire philosophy. And thereby, of course, also resisting ontology in a way. I don't know, am I mistaken? Did I misunderstand something? What do you think, Andrew? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. No, I don't think you're mistaken. I suppose we're coming at this from different perspectives. And when you say, are you still in Hegelian dialectics, Andrew? I'm not sure. I don't know if I've ever been there, but it sounds nice. I suppose what I'm thinking is I see the danger in terms of, this is always the difficulty when we start talking about difference in some way and trying to find a new way to integrate it or to do something with it. And yes, there's a danger that can perhaps tip over into some kind of ontological imperialism of its own. But perhaps if the starting point disavows that as a matter of principle, or is starting from the perspective of being suspicious of that, almost by definition, perhaps that's an attempt that kind of thinking to prevent that from happening. But I don't think that can ever be totally foreclosed. I think that is always a danger, and that's, any kind of thought is I keep going back to that nice Levinasian line about thought being a kind of violence. That's there as well. By me talking about this and trying to bring these various people together for my own purposes, I'm doing violence to their own project, and perhaps they would go, Andrew, no, hold on, we want nothing to do with this. We're doing something entirely different. So I think the question you pose to me is open and really important, and one that I need to think about, because yes, there is a danger of what I'm talking about here just being a reduction, again, another kind of reducing the otherness of the other. I don't know if that's I've engaged at an appropriate level with your question, but that's what springs to mind at this point. But I'll dwell on it and I'll think about it.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Ron, please.
Well, thank you. What an inspirational and tremendous talk we've had from Andrew. One wants to go away and think about it rather than ask a question. And I just put up a little question in the chat, and it's already been undone by Andrew in the last section of your talk, Andrew. So I'm reluctant to repeat what I've already put up, because I was suggesting that there might be coming through both your talk and my talk, two ideas of ontology, but then you went on in your talk to talk about multiple ontologies. So I'll just leave that hanging there and just take the opportunity of my question time to push you a bit on, bearing in mind this is a webinar series within the philosophy and theory of higher education society, to press you a little bit on the implications of your talk for higher education, because it seemed to me, and although I've been talking about ontology for some time, my work, you really pressed me in a way and inspired me to ask this question to myself. Suppose we ditched epistemology as the fundamental category of higher education and embraced ontology. Now, what would that mean? What would that mean for the university? What would it mean for teaching and learning? What would it mean for the university as a major institution in society and in the world? I mean, and that to me is a mind-boggling question. I don't know whether you've got a response to that now, but you've certainly put to me the challenge to go on worrying about that question.
If I can try to respond, Ron, but again, this is another one I need to think about, and thank you. And I'm going to respond in a way, because I've been teaching your text actually recently. I was teaching, I was doing a course on integrating teaching and research. And one of the things that came up in our discussions was the integrating of teaching and research, when we're asked to do that, is framed in an epistemological way a lot of the time. And it's framed as in, okay, well, how do we get them to know something about research, and how do we get them to interact with the primary texts? But you talk about, well, there's other ways of interacting with that integration of teaching and learning as well. And it's the being of a student, sorry, the being of a researcher. So getting students to experience the being of what it is to do research. And I thought that was a thing that when we discussed it in the class, it opened up the conversation in a much more interesting direction, because this is kind of responding to your what happened if we ditched epistemology. So we ditched epistemology in that discussion about what it would look like to integrate teaching and learning. And what happened then was it opened up to a conversation about, well, what kind of students are we talking about? Because if we're framing it in an epistemological sense, it's success, failure. They learned the content or they didn't learn the content in a way. But if we start talking about beings, it's, well, what would this knowledge be for them? Are these researchers to be, or these people going to be going out in the world, or are they in higher education to get some kind of qualification? And they're not hugely interested in all of these things in the same way that we are. So I think either way, whatever kind of ontology we would start to engage with, I think it starts provoking different questions, and different questions I think are a start. A difference is good. That's a good start. But but yeah, it's still something that I'm still exploring and still playing with. So I think that's one I want to explore a bit more about. Yeah, what happens if we do just start framing more things in those ontological terms? Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Ron. Svetlana, please.
Thank you, Andrew, for your interesting presentation and a lot of insights for those who are focused on more applied or practical issues of higher education, focused on university governance, internationalization policy, and degree program management like me. I would say that, and it might be related with Ronald's question as well, about implications of the theory to higher education issues. It's your presentation, your ideas are very resonated with my own personal career and research, because during 30 years, more than 30 years, I have been playing different roles of university stakeholders. Administrative staff, professional staff, academic, researcher. So researcher is an academic without teaching workload, educational leader. And unfortunately, I did not reach yet a position of top manager, but a combination of more than 10 universities in my career give me a chance to propose the reliability and productiveness of the theory suggested by Kallenberg, for example. Kallenberg suggests four types of university stakeholders who are in the middle. They are in the middle of the organization of study affairs, academic affairs. So if you look at top managers, we all know that, of course, they are vice rectors. As a rule, they have doctoral degrees, but they have not many time for their research being the vice rectors. So they are university top managers, and they are somewhere in the middle. They have something in their heart which pushes them to the research more than to administration. So they are somewhere in between. There are educational administrators who are between the regulation, I mean the head of the departments at the university level, Department of Study Affair, Academic Affair, HR department. They are also in the middle. They are also in the middle. Of course, I have a very specific experience where in at least 9 Russian universities where there are no academic freedom, but I would assume when I visited 5 Finnish universities and asked them about the procedure of curriculum design, they told no. I studied collaborative degree, and I asked about the curricular design, which is the core. I asked them, is it your problem or the problem of your Russian partners? They told, no, it's our pain. A dean told me that it is his pain to agree a curricula in within the department.
Svetlana,
And with yes, I'm
wrap up your comment into a question.
So my question is, what is your view on the perspectives of your theory in higher education management and university governance?
And thank you for that. And I think it is important to, you know, how important context is and background, and being able to draw on that to frame a question like that. So thank you. I think what you're talking, to my mind, how that relates is, yes, there's being structurally and organizationally in the middle, and there's being caught in the middle is one way of approaching that. And Kallenberg's work, I would need to refer back to it and to see where the overlaps may be. I'm thinking of the middle in perhaps a different way. I think there's certainly overlaps with that organizational and the structural perspective and being caught between roles. I'm thinking less I think in that perhaps sociological or organizational perspective than in the individual lived experience of what is the nature of a being inhabiting those roles. But again, that's a kind of a literature that I'll have to engage with and have to explore more. So if you had comments on that and you wanted to send them to me, I'd be more than happy to have a look at that. So thank you very much, Svetlana.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's Martin. Martin, go. Come on.
Thank you, Christian. Yes, hello. A very rich talk, Andrew. And I was attracted to it, particularly in the abstract, the outline that you mentioned, Thomas Nagel's view from nowhere, and I was wondering how you wanted to use that. I mean, for me, I think I'm right. The idea is the view from nowhere. It's sort of an account of the whole universe or whatever part of it, but from no particular person's perspective. But however far that goes, it cannot capture what it is for me to realise that I'm in this particular place and I'm somewhere and I'm me. So that account view from nowhere doesn't capture that. And I think you're endorsing that sort of picture, saying we have to recover that sort of perspectivalism in the sense that, I mean, Nagel isn't an extreme perspectivalist, the Nietzsche mold, for example. But I wanted to sort of pick up on the point mentioned briefly by Ron, which was about the multiple ontologies, and particularly your suggestion that they could be used as tools. That's the bit that troubles me. So if the different ontologies are available to us, to any one of us, then where am I? Where are each of us? And it sounds like we don't inhabit those ontologies if there are tools. We're outside of them, so we're back to nowhere. And I think you won't want to say that. So have I uncovered a sort of tricky sort of reconciliation problem with the different parts of your thesis?
Thanks for that, Martin. That's a gnarly one. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm coming from a more of a perspective of Gadamer. So for him, the notion of, and here we're talking about, I'm thinking about his hermeneutical perspective on phenomenology. And for him, there's such a thing as a virtuous circle. So framing something as being you're inside and you're using it, for him isn't a difficulty, and there's not a performative contradiction in that, because that's what we do. It's the same as Paul Ricoeur makes a distinction between, there's approaches in philosophy that attempt to describe the world, and then his view is, well, what hermeneutics is attempting to do is interpret that description. So I think that's my approach to ontology in this sense, that for me, ontology is a description, but it's also a form of interpretation of the world. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's other directions one could come at this from. And I'm thinking in terms of this notion of a universal view from nowhere. Charles Mills springs to mind as well, that anytime there's a purported universal description of how things are, so the social contract, it has material conditions, it had racial conditions, it had all of these social conditions that lots of people weren't able to step outside. So they were inside that description. But that was not their description. It was not a tool for them. It was put onto them. So I think what you're pinpointing is a difficult point, and I think it is troubling in many ways. But I find it less troubling than the alternative. Maybe that's what I'll say, that there's friction and there's a gnarliness. But it's a difficulty I'm more comfortable dwelling with and seeing where I can go with it. But again, that is what I'm going to have to think about, Martin. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? There's Franek. I have also one. So yeah, I will be in the waiting line. Come on, Franek.
Okay, so maybe quick question. Thanks very much for the inspiring talk. And I was wondering, like, how important for like this ontology from the middle approach is notion of like political struggle or some kind of like political resistance, because I think you would agree that like all these attempts to perceive a world from the like middle and then applying this ontology on the middle have to be done in like a political environment where some kind of like very strong hierarchical thinking is like influences us, maybe not all the time, but like most of the time. So like in higher education, we can try to like perceive world from the middle, but then like we have to apply for a job or a scholarship when we are evaluated how central and how excellent we are, etc. So like it's like this kind of struggle between like hierarchized like society and hierarchized like higher education and like this approach from the middle, how important it is, do you think?
Thanks, Frank. Yeah. And how important is it? It's central. This is, for me, this is where it came from. This is what kind of sparked it. Like for me, I mean, it's no mistake that I'm referring to Graeber, and it's no mistake that I'm referring to Murray Bookchin. Because what I'm thinking about there is these multiple ontologies. These are ontologies that, in terms of having an ontology of the middle, it's one that we can deploy. It is one we can use as a tool. So if we see the world just in terms of the flatness of there's power and there's nothing that we can do and there's a structure, there's no scope for us to have agency. There's no scope for us to do anything. So our engagement with being there is dominated, basically. We are as dominated as every other being is in that ontology. What I was trying to play with or trying to explore is something like, you know, an ontological equivalent of the anarchist temporary zone of autonomy. You know, there's a space that can be created where we do something. So fine, we're in these hierarchical institutions. We've got these requirements that we need to fulfill. There's job descriptions, there's various requirements that we have. And yet we carve out these spaces where we're doing something different, like here. For me, this is an example of an ontology of the middle. There's a load of us from different perspectives. We're different kinds of beings with different interests. And we came together to talk about something like this, which is important to us. So I think it's crucially important. And it's central to how I came from it. And maybe that's going to cause difficulties for people in terms of what their view is of the validity or the rigor of this as an approach. But I couldn't but think of this in terms of resistance. Thanks, Frank.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank and Andrew. Any other comments and questions to Andrew? Okay, I can simply ask a quick one and have a small rejoinder with Soren's way of asking questions about the perspective of the middle and the role of Levinas and the otherness in all this thinking. Because from nearly every single reference that you made during this presentation, I was seeing some other references, like other connections to the works of the same people who speaks about the common and the commonness, like, which is the other way of putting the perspective of the middle. Because what is the middle in the lesson Guattari in the opening chapter on the rhizome? It's the position without borders. It's the position of us being embedded in the set of network of relationships, dependencies, and so on. And it came to my mind also when you were referring to Anna Singh, her book about mushroom at the end of the world, which is all about this connectivity and the other form of thinking about the position of the middle. And I like Soren, I simply cannot digest the role of Levinas here with the otherness, which assumes some kind of a rupture with the dialectics, but also rupture with the commonness, like with the like absolute otherness of the other, which simply ruptures the relation. And what you propose, I would say, like seen from my eyes, is proposing the idea of the middle as being in the middle of a common web of relationship, and all of your references speak about that. Well, so my as always, it's rather a comment than a question, but yeah, how you
Yeah.
reconcile, or I don't know, like regain this Levinas for this project, or maybe this is like a philosophy that needs to be like a starting point, but maybe not in your wagon.
Yeah, I think for me to reconcile that, this would then turn into a theory, and I'm not quite there yet. So this is still at the level of an account, but it's a really important point. Myself and Storm were having a conversation about this before. There's a really nice bit in Schopenhauer where he's talking about how ethics is actually, how people are talking about ethics. They're actually talking about politics. They're not talking about the one-to-one relationship. They're not talking about being with being. They're talking about how should we organize things. And I think that's maybe a way that I would start approaching answering this question, because I see your point about the connections with the common. Definitely they're there. I think where I'm coming with is what happens when you're uncommon. So this is, maybe I've got a commons of the uncommon. So it's a parallel project to yourself and Jakob's project in lots of ways. But yeah, this is what queer studies asks. What happens when you're not part of the community, or what happens when the community defines you out?
So for a dialogical mode, because I want to join this exact point. I think that queer position is and it's used like that in some works, like for example by Hart and Negri, is an ultimate position of the commonness. Like this is and I would say it could be saved as such, not as some kind of uncommonness. It's like the I don't know, like I don't have a clear theory for that, only thinking in dialogue in common with you. But yeah, think about that, because queering things is like going beyond this imposition of totalizing like dichotomies, and this is why they are like always in the middle, showing the potentiality for like commonness beyond the stupidity of the dualities. Right?
And this is one of the tensions that's there, and it's a really interesting one that's happened in recent years when people have moved away from queer theory and they're going back towards queer studies, because what's happened is, well, people want community, but they don't want communitarianism. You cannot be queer in some ways without recognizing that you're with others. So this is that shared meaning. But what happens, it's Marxism in the Groucho form. I don't want to be a member of any club that would have me as a member. So this is, I think this is the tension that they're working through, and maybe this is what I'm trying to digest in some ways, and what your project is aiming towards as well. And maybe we're going to approach some way to square the circle. But I think, to come back to the point about Levinas, I think that was my starting point, and from that there's a leap, to use that Heideggerian way of putting it. There was a leap into something else, but it was Levinas, I suppose, that kicked me away from ontology into somewhere else. But there's definitely a gap. There's a chasm between those two things.
But
and that's what I'm still exploring.
I think that it forms a perfect, like a ground for your position in the middle. Like you can use this Levinas, and on the other side, Hart and Negri, to position yourself like in the middle, like between this like ultimate commonness and like a rupture of otherness by Levinas.
Between Levinas and a Hart place, I think that's what
and a hard place. Yeah, it would be even a job. Even I can get it. So it's maybe not nice. But okay. So not monopolizing the dialogue. I think that there is like so much intellectual, like vibration coming from the Andrew's presentation. That's comment. Please comment, and please share with us your thoughts about the middle, ontology, queering the university. Yeah, maybe it's like we need to switch the discussion, like thinking or helping Andrew think more about the consequences or implications for the university, because it's like super, inspirational, theoretical, philosophical perspective. But yeah, we need to go into higher education, but there's a lot in the presentation as well. Sorry for talking too much. So anybody, or maybe you want to have a break. Rasmus, come on.
Okay, I'll jump in here as well. I've had a comment/question in the back of my mind since you ended your talk, because we had another talk here on Christian's show, David Backer, on Althusser and higher education, and this might be a complete what do you call it, like shot not in the dark, but shot like off the target. But I couldn't help but trying to make some parallels between his presentation, his talk, and your talk, because of course he talked about Althusser, about the university understood as the ideological state apparatus, as part of the ideological state apparatus, and part of his reading of Althusser and also other thinkers in the line of Althusser. There is a lot of thinking about the university as being in the middle, in the sense of being in the middle of tension between the state and the market, or in the tensions between class inequalities or economic inequality, political inequalities, and of course there's also part of this thinking is we also have the argument that the university is reduced to a certain function, and I couldn't help but think, like when you were talking about ontology as reduction, and then thinking about the university being reduced to having certain functions by the state or by the market, and these things, and maybe like, so I think my comment also come in line or is parallel to what Franek asked, but I was wondering if you had any, what your comments would be to making these parallels to David Backer or Althusser, and thinking, especially when you brought up the title Undoing Undoing Mastery, or was it Unthinking Mastery, and I especially think that the university as an institution has been mastered, right, by the state, by the market, and thinking about undoing that mastering would be an interesting line of argument, line of thinking.
Thanks, Rasmus.
So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rasmus. Yeah, and I can see the difficulties of trying to formulate it, and maybe that's the issue we have with the tools we have available to us that can make it difficult to even formulate this, because I haven't seen Baker's talk, but I'm just thinking about it from reading Althusser. Like, I was always struck by the fact that, well, where is the university in terms of the ideological state apparatus and the repressive state apparatus? Is it kind of in between the two of those things? Similarly, what's an ambulance? Is it ideological or is it repressive? I don't know. So that, I mean, this is the kind of thing I'm provoked by, and why I find the middle as being useful, because I think we do find spaces continually, and we do have these modes of thinking about our own university at little moments where we have the sense that we can do something, and there's something we can change, and they can be organized in different ways, and that there is potential. I have found one way for me thinking about that more clearly is to have this resource of the middle, being in the middle, and where that middle might lie and what middling might be. That it's kind of expanded my sense of possibility. That's for me, that's all the best that I could hope for this, is that it might expand the sense of potential that we can have in terms of the various ways that we can be in the university. So again, I mean, this is one for me to dwell with and to explore. But I think there is something powerful about the university being in between, and we continually enact this. We continually enact pushing back against that reduction. So maybe it's useful to have a vocabulary and a framework with which we can actually express that, whether it's the common or the middle or being an ecological institution. I think these are all resources, and the more of them that we have, the better. Profusion over reduction, for sure. Thanks, Rasmus.
Svetlana.
Rasmus's comments reminded me the idea which I met at Jacques Le Gouff's book, Middle-Aged Intellectuals, when he notioned that the middle-aged university since the moment of its appearance stand out from this middle-aged societal structure, because it did not belong to any class, anything. It was always in the middle, or even in the middle-aged society. So thank you, Rasmus. I think this idea is very fruitful if we look at it from the School of Annals and approaches. Thank you.
Thanks, Svetlana. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of where I'm coming from as well. I can't hide my influences and your Pierre Clastres or James Scott. This notion that I think what the state has attempted to do is to reduce, is to make the state and society synonymous. And in some societies, it's been more successful at doing that. But there's a powerful set of resources within the institution or within higher education. In Ireland, we have a binary system. So the different institutions have ways of expressing that they serve society and they're within society, but they're not of society, and they're certainly not of the state. And I think to have whatever resources we can have to articulate that fine, we want to do things, for society, but because we're in society, we're here, but we're different. And I think that's, again, maybe I'm hammering the point about difference, but as you rightly point out, it was a different kind of entity in the Middle Ages, and it's continued to be a different kind of entity today. And that differentness is the source of all of our travails and all of our troubles in our interactions with overreaching states. But it's also the source of our power, and it's why people come to us. Thanks, Svetlana.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, all of you. I think that we reached the time limits. And for this reason, some people simply left. Thank you for the participation in the seminar. There will be another one coming soon, but and it will be me and Jakub giving it. So it's a pity that I don't remember when it is. But you can find the information on PATH's website, and we will inform about it through the.
It's the 23rd of March.
23rd of March. Very, very nice. I will put down that. Very nice. Think about submitting papers to PATH's conference, which will happen sometime in June or something like that. The deadline is 15th of March, I would say. It will happen to be in Poland by some strange accidents. And it will be nice to have you in Poland. Think about joining our conversation on ontology and university, maybe proposing a paper on that, because we will be counting on you composing a volume afterwards, after the cycle, and something like that. But there will be more information about later on. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Andrew, for super insightful presentation. I'm really encouraging you to develop a theory. But all these remarks and, public thinking is also beautiful. So, yeah. Thank you, and see you next month, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your comments.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.